decentralized. Greeks had an empire, but it was not centralized. Here's what he meant. As Americans ventured toward the Pacific, they would reenact the primal scene of the English colonists. They would clear the forests, build societies, and when strong enough, would form states. In time, economic, cultural, and other interests would come into conflict such that a division of the Union itself would be necessary. Jefferson wrote to Joseph Priestley, January 29, 1804, that he would be happy to see a Mississippi Confederacy, as he called it, alongside the old Atlantic Confederacy. And he even imagined a Pacific Federation, later composed of, quote, free and independent Americans, unconnected with us, except by the ties of blood and interest, and employing like us the rights of self-government. So in time, America would naturally, the states would divide through secession in the direction of a republican scale of representation. And that would happen within the states too. And then the Union itself, since it's continental, would divide probably into three federations. One with its economic life on the Atlantic, one with its economic life on the Mississippi, and one with its economic life on the Pacific. They would all be American unions, but they would not be governed from the center. Historian Daniel, there's something here. Okay. This was a very popular view, by the way. We've forgotten about it. Thomas Hart Benton told the Senate in 1825. Now listen to this. In planting the seed of a new power on the coast of the Pacific Ocean, it should be well understood that when strong enough to take care of itself, the new government should separate from the mother empire as the child separates from the parent at the age of manhood. But this is going to be a division because the public condition says when it's too big, you divide. Historian Daniel Bernstein observes, quote, Jefferson propagandized for an independent Pacific Federation, and in the 1820s, many leading Americans, including Albert Gallatin, James Monroe, William Crawford, Henry Clay, Thomas Hart Benton, and arguably James Madison, shared the vision. Bernstein continues that the Jeffersonian vision of, quote, the United States as a planter of new nations had an appeal we long forgotten. End quote. Remember, Virginia was called the mother of states? The United States should be the mother of new nations. Because it would be too big otherwise for self-government. Now, this was Jefferson's vision of what America should develop into. So when 11 American states voted to secede and form a federation of their own in 1861, they were not guilty of treason, as Lincoln said they were. They were acting in accord with Jefferson's Empire of Liberty, which allowed for territorial division if a polity, if it grew so large as to become dysfunctional. By 1860, the Union, by any standard, was dysfunctional. Notice this, it had expanded to 4 times its original size in only 50 years. I mean, this would be enough to disorient anyone. That's expansion in light years. I mean, it had grown too large too fast. It was dysfunctional. And the American tradition up to that point, from the Declaration of Independence, recommended one thing: division. But this natural development, rooted in the Republican tradition, was violently cut short by Lincoln's decision to make war on the seceding states, to force them back into a union from which their people had voted to secede. Now, prior to what we may call the Lincolnian Revolution, and it is a revolution, We get a completely different ballgame after that. The Jeffersonian notion of republicanism pretty much dominated from 1776 to 1861. Okay. There are two Americas. There's a Jeffersonian America from 1776 to 1861, and there's a Lincolnian America from 1865 until today. They're completely incompatible as far as the principles are concerned. But we've inherited both. Everyone here has a Jeffersonian and Lincolnian all mixed up together. They don't fit very well. Sometimes you feel indigestion. Okay, Jefferson ran for president. Well, let's ask this question. What was America like under Jeffersonian republicanism? Let's just focus on that. He ran for president on a platform of state and local sovereignty, one plank of which was to abolish inland federal taxes. Did you hear that? To abolish all inland federal taxes. And he kept his word. From 1800 to 1861, there were no inland federal taxes, no income tax, no excise tax, except for a brief period during the War of 1812. The central government lived off a tariff on imports. South funded about 75% of American imports, lived off a tariff on that trade, and by selling land to people, Western land. Another Jeffersonian, Andrew Jackson, succeeded in getting rid of the federal debt, 1835. Got rid of the federal debt. Got rid of it. In the process, he destroyed the Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve. That's Americanism. Lincolnian Americanism brings back the bank and all the rest of it. Now, consider what America was like in 1861. Let's just go through it. 1861. There were no inland federal taxes. The federal debt was negligible. There was no so-called national bank. As in Switzerland, there was no standing army. The sword was in the hands of the states. American industrial achievements were surpassing Europe in 1861. And Americans did not lag too far behind in intellectual and cultural achievements. Its citizens enjoyed more liberty than any people on earth then or before had ever had. But it was not just that the central government was limited. If you look at the states, they too were very limited in their power to tax and regulate. You see, so the states were sort of de facto divided into these little communities that had more sovereignty than today, because they kept the revenue. Now, what I've just described to you is not a philosopher's utopia. This is not a bright idea. This was the United States as it existed in 1861. It was Jefferson's Empire of Liberty, and it was a remarkable achievement in the history of the world. And it was this Constitution that the Swiss copied or were inspired by in 1848. Unfortunately, this Jeffersonian America, this Empire of Liberty, is rarely, if ever, taught in high schools, colleges, or universities. Young people know nothing about it. Probably most of you in this room know nothing about it. No insults, but I didn't know nothing about it until I started working. But you know, I'm an academic. I just sit around and read. Other people don't have time. But you see the point. This is part of our tradition. It's not some other country. The only tradition Americans know is Lincolnian republicanism. Now let's go to that. As 1861, the Jeffersonian Empire of Liberty was in place. Well, just to sum it up, what Lincoln does is he denies the connection between republicanism and size. Because he does this by denying the states of sovereign political societies. If they are sovereign political societies, then there can be nullification, interposition, and even secession, as Jefferson points out. That has to be the case. Canada, for example, has state nullification. A province can nullify any federal law, area of civil rights, and it has the right, the Canadian provinces have the right to secede. They don't need to exercise those rights because since they have them, the central government watches its steps. Quebec almost seceded in 1995. Lincoln held that the states were not and never been sovereign political societies. He said we should think of them as counties. Let me quote you from Lincoln. He asks incredulously, quote, "What is this particular sacredness of a state? If a state in one instance and a county in another should be equal in extent of territory and equal in the number of people, wherein is that state any better than the county?" Well, someone else hearing this concluded that a man who could not tell the difference between an American state and a county was so ignorant of the American political tradition that he probably shouldn't be president. So nobody voted for him in the South. Okay. In order for self-government to be meaningful, there must be a human scale to representation. Now let's talk about that a bit. What would that be? Well, Madison argued that there should be one representative in the House of Representatives for every 30,000 people. Now this is the point of my talk, representation. For the sake of argument, let's take Madison's ratio as the measure. People have other ratios, but let's just take his. In 1910, the House of Representatives kept its members to 435, as we have today. The population of the U.S. is 315 today, 315 million, which gives us one representative for every 725,000 people. Write your congressman. Let your views be known. Get involved. He listens to those who pay his bill. Elected, not you. And you would be the same way, and I would too if we were in this position. Even worse, by mid-century the population will be around 435 million, which will give us one representative for every million people. By the end of the century, the Census Bureau predicts over 1 billion people in the United States. You get the picture. Something's got to give. You can't keep on business as usual. 435 representatives and the population growing. There has to be structural constitutional change. And I'm saying this not in the name of any political ideology, but in the name of Republican self-government as understood by the tradition. But what are we going to do? Should we increase the size of the House? No. Judging, everything has a scale, and judging the lawmaking bodies around the world, 435 is about the right size. 600 is about as high as you ever get. Usually 200, somewhere there, 200, 600. If we expanded the House, let's see if we expand the House using Madison's ratio, 1 for every 30,000, there would be 10,500 members in the House. Oh, what a giggle. But it wouldn't matter because they don't show up anyway. But what are we to conclude from this? Are we to say that Madison's ratio is wrong? Or are we to say the United States has become simply too large and dysfunctional for the purposes of self-government? It's too big. Nothing wrong with this ratio. The conclusion seems inescapable. Either the United States should be divided somehow into 2 or more federations, as Jefferson's Empire of Liberty allows, or most of its functions should be returned to the states, except for those sealed enumerated powers granted to it by the Constitution. This problem is not going to go away as the population increases. It's going to become more and more pressing. It's time to think about it now. Now, someone might object, and this is what I hear a lot. There's nothing sacred about Madisons Ratio. Well, even in the 18th century, they didn't have painless dentistry, you know, didn't have TV or anything. But we have technology, we have advanced communication and travel. So, you know, our ratio is 1 for every 725,000 is fine. Representation presupposes the human body and its ability to speak and hear. It has nothing to do with technology, and that's never going to change. So let me just try to show you this thought experiment. Let's suppose that we bring our ratio, which we think is fine, with all of our technology. Let's bring it back into 1790. We'll put it all there with the PowerPoint and everything. There were about 4 million people there. Well, if we brought our ratio back, there would be only 5 members in the House. 5 states would have 1 representative, but 8 would have none. You see the point? Technology has nothing to do with it. This has to do with the human frame. Nobody here would say that was an adequate ratio of representation for the House in 1790, would you? When 8 states have no representation and 5 have only 1. Madison's ratio is okay. Ours fails by our standards, not his. But the matter is worse than that. Most of the laws we live under are not passed by Congress at all, but flow from the vast impenetrable bureaucracies that control under the control of one man, the president. Fault, of course, is largely due to Congress, who's outsourced its activities to these bureaucracies. Congress has the power to control money that it gave to the Federal Reserve. It can make commercial treaties, giving it to the president. Nor is that all. The Supreme Court has usurped the power of the states to make major social policy on marriage, abortion, law enforcement, religion, education, and 100 other things clearly reserved to the states. But let us imagine for a moment, let's accept the Lincolnian view, which rules out state nullification and secession as impossible. How can we think, with that sort of regime, how can we think of self-government? In other words, how would we reform that sort of Lincolnian regime so that we can have self-government without state nullification and the like? Well, fortunately, we have an essay on this. David Hume, great Scottish philosopher, in 1752, wrote an essay called Idea of a Perfect Commonwealth. He was a friend of Franklin. Madison and Hamilton, we know, read this essay. It didn't influence them much, but and he gave us the first model for a large republic. Remember now, the tradition up to that time, for 2,500 years, had said republics have to be small. There's just no negotiating that. You can't have rule of law and self-government around. But Hume said, no, wait a minute, we do have Switzerland, and we can imagine, something bigger than that. And so he gives us a model. But what he tries to do in this is what Jefferson tries to do. He tries to give us big size, because there are advantages to that, but he tries to preserve the small scale of little federated republics. This is what we've lost. Let me describe that republic to you briefly, and then we'll see how it compares to the United States. Hume asks us to imagine a large country the size, say, of France, which is divided into 100 small republics, not counting the sovereign states. Each of these is in turn divided into 100 parishes. Each year, the citizens of each parish meet in a local school, church, or other place to elect one representative to their small republic. So that republic will have 100 representatives. It'll be about the size of maybe a DeKalb County, or smaller. Out of which 10 are chosen to perform the executive and judicial functions of the republic. Now remember, this DeKalb County is not a county, understand? It's a sovereign state. And let's say Georgia's this way, Georgia got 100.